Hi, my name is Julie Mohr, and welcome to my webinar today on Demystifying the ITIL version 2011 edition. As many of you probably know, we do have a new version of the ITIL framework that was released in August in 2011. And I know that I personally have a lot of students that have begun their ITIL expert journey and are wondering what the new edition means to them. So this webinar is meant to help you to understand the differences between version 2007 and 2011 and help you to understand and quantify those differences as part of your ongoing education for your ITIL expert path. A little bit about myself. I have been working in IT for a very long time. I've served in many different capacities, working in operations all the way through being a consultant, a director of an IT organization, and now today I own my own business. I am an author, travel around the world and speak at different conferences, and I can't wait to bring you the message about the newest release. This is kind of one of the ways that I can help you as a practitioner to better understand things about the ITIL framework and the differences with this new release. I work as a trainer for ITpreneurs and have had a long-standing relationship with ITpreneurs and actually have helped with some of the design efforts that take place with their curriculum. So this is a great opportunity for me to help them to get the message out there about the new release and the differences, specifically the differences within the 5 books in the publication. So today we're going to kind of take a look at what was given to us in the 2007 edition so that we can then compare it to what we see now in the 2011 edition. And then we're going to take a look at the kind of the overall structure of each book, which has been, greater definition has been put around what each book should look like, so there's some consistency. And then we'll go book by book and look at the major changes that have occurred within each of those books. And kind of the volume of change that has occurred within each of the books. And then we'll kind of wrap it up with a little bit of context for those of you who are on your ITIL expert path, what this means to you. With the adoption of ITIL 2007, what we saw within the framework was a significant move from a process-oriented approach to a lifecycle approach. What that did for us was, as a whole, we now started to think about how all the processes in the service and the components and the people and the business fit together, much more looking at comprehensively at this value network that we're so integrated within the business today that it's kind of hard to deliver value just from a process perspective. So we saw this big focus on how do you get a service into the live environment? How do you develop an IT organization as a strategic asset? For organizations that had worked with ITIL version 2, this was the next kind of step in the evolution. It gave us this kind of a maturity path that provided additional growth. If you have the processes, what comes after that? For organizations that were new and just starting out with ITIL, it still had a lot of the core information that came out of the V2 books. You could still take a process-oriented approach if that's where the maturity of your organization was at the time. So this was a framework that may have been considered initially as being overwhelming. But I think as the industry kind of took a look at the framework, we really began to see that you take from it what you need from the framework. You don't necessarily, one organization isn't going to implement everything in all 5 books. But it had something to offer every organization, and it really helped us to understand how everything fits together from a delivery perspective of value to the business. Now, the 2011 edition, clearly there's more physical pages. If you look at the physical books, there are quite a few of the books have a much thicker binding than they did previously. This doesn't necessarily mean that the content represents an expansion of information in each of the books. There was an emphasis on fixing what was missing, improving some of the areas that were a little confusing in the 2007 edition, and especially kind of making certain that if we're talking about a concept in one book, that it was equally reflected in the same type of description in another book. That way you didn't get two different views of the same information. Another very important thing I think that they put into the 2011 edition that we didn't see in 2007 is a common process model approach to the processes that are defined as processes in the framework. So when you look at that process model, it defines the inputs, the outputs, the control, the trigger, the enablers. We now see that this is consistently applied to all the processes in the framework. That's a benefit. All it does is create greater consistency within some of those processes that were a little vague. We also see an attempt to create a lot more connection between the different phases of the life cycle. So now we're tracking the inputs and the outputs between the different phases and making that a little clearer so that we understand how to make each of the phases successful, as well as the processes within the phases. There was also a little bit of difficulty around roles and responsibilities. We had this definition of a process owner and a process manager, but yet many of the roles seem to be kind of a blend of the two. So there's a little bit more clarity in 2007 around the roles now. If you take a look comprehensively at the books, there's about 200 more pages in strategy, 100 in each in design, transition, and operations, and a little less in CSI. So there's, and that's not necessarily new content, that's improving existing content. Other than that, the books fairly much remain the same. In fact, you can go in and most of the language, the core portion of the books is the same. But it makes sense, especially if you focus in a particular area of the life cycle, to understand what did change in case there would be further guidance that would help you in that particular area of the framework. If we look at the overall structure now, in each of the books, there's a lot of consistency. There's an introduction to the life cycle in Chapter 1 in all of the books. There's also basic concepts that are in Chapter 2. Then we have the principles and guidance for each one of the phases. Chapter 4 is dedicated to the processes within the phase. Chapter 5 is kind of a catch-all because we have differences in the different phases, and there was a need for being able to put kind of common-like things in one particular chapter. 6 is dedicated now to organizing, 7 is really the technology, 8 implementation, and 9 challenges and critical success factors. And then each one of the books, although it's not a consistent appendix number or letter for each of the books, we now have an appendix on additional guidance that's the same across each of the books. Now, you might be wondering, why do this? I think it's much better because each of the books can now stand on their own. You don't actually have to own all the books in the service life cycle to fill in the pieces for one of the phases. It very much allows each one of these books to stand on their own and represent how it truly fits into the entire life cycle approach. It also makes it easier when you think about when you go to the books, you're going to know what chapter is dedicated to which of the concepts across the life cycle, and it just creates a lot of efficiency across that view. Now, in the upfront material, what we see, Chapter 1, we get the best management practice portfolio. That's all of the guidance that's produced by the best management practice. It discusses all the different frameworks that they have and how they fit together. So that's kind of not really a sales pitch, but it does kind of talk about more than just ITIL, but where ITIL fits into their whole practice portfolio. There's also a section on why ITIL is important and successful in many organizations. Chapter 2, there's a focus in there on governance and management systems that I didn't necessarily see in the previous editions. And then, of course, this appendix, this new guidance on supplementary types of frameworks, quality management, risk management, governance, COBIT. It's now a consistent appendix across all the books, although I had to put Appendix N because it's not the same letter associated with the appendix in each of the 5 publications. Now, service strategy was, I hate to admit it was a very difficult book to read. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy reading it. There was a lot of really good content and theory, but I wasn't really certain exactly how to translate that into something tangible within an organization. So because the content was difficult to understand, I may have been able to try to help an organization, but that didn't necessarily mean that when they were using the ITIL framework, they could understand what we were trying to do. So it really needed something to address the difficulty in the content in the book itself. The structure was also a little difficult to follow. It kind of jumped all over the place. So that was one of the biggest issues that I had with the book, is it didn't seem to flow smoothly between concept to concept. And then there were certain concepts that needed clarity. They're just very wordy sections of the book that didn't really seem to kind of come up with a clear definition of the concepts that we're looking at. So the additional pages in service strategy, what we see they focused on were much clearer explanations of the content, better diagrams. They got rid of some, improved some, and even added some new ones, which I think really helped with understanding the content. That the new diagrams are much better. We also see business relationship management is now a process. It wasn't in the previous version, at least it wasn't clearly a process, so now it is. Financial management is now called financial management for IT services. It has been improved, and in fact, they actually brought some of the the version 2 content into it that seemed to be kind of dropped when it went into the 2007 edition, which really we lack that whole view of accounting, budgeting, and charging, which is still very instrumental to the financial management for IT services. And then we see the renaming of strategy generation, or the process that was called service strategy. It was very confusing in the books exactly what the name of that was, and the role that it fit into service strategy. So we see some clarity in this process now. It is now called strategy management for services. And there's much better definition on how it fits in to the service strategy phase and with the service portfolio. So this is a summary that breaks down all the modifications chapter by chapter. And what I did was, instead of just looking at what changed, I wanted to make sure I broke this down into what was new in the books, because you as a practitioner studying service strategy want to know, okay, what wasn't in there before? That's the first thing you want to know. And then maybe some of the areas that you were confused in, is there additional guidance or clarification that will help you to better understand the content? So here we see better definition of customers and services, this balance in service strategy, new diagrams, looking at the differences between internal and external customers, strategies for customer satisfaction, and then this section on inputs and outputs. Very key new things we have there. The formal process now, strategy management for IT services, and I mentioned the budgeting, accounting, and charging being added in business relationship management. Now we've improved the concept of strategy, how to use information to establish our strategy, better definition on a difference between a customer and a user, and it gets into much more around the internal-external view than we had before. So a lot of really good stuff. We also see them integrating some of the cloud into the books, which wasn't addressed in the previous edition. Now, service design wasn't a bad book, but what kind of left itself to interpretation was, how does service design fit together to create that service design package? What are the overall kind of governing activities that get us through this phase of the life cycle and into the next? We kind of understood that we have these processes that generate some sort of value, but how do they work together to create a service design into that service design package? So we needed some standardization, and we needed a better definition of the overall approach. So what we got was better information on organizational development, risk management. We have the service catalog has been cleared up. It's no longer really two separate entities, which really came out of the previous books, the business service catalog and technical service catalog. Now it's just two views of the same information, which is much more representative, I think, of what we see in the market space. better improvement around the 5 aspects of the service design. We see that the service contract database has now been renamed as the Service Contract Management Information System. Better information on roles and responsibility, and some new stuff on training, as well as the overall definition of those activities within service design. So here we see again broken down what's new in each of the chapters and what has been enhanced or modified. I think for many organizations who are struggling with trying to figure out how to do a service catalog, I think the information that's in the books will be very helpful there. There's better definition and consistency across all the processes. I think that's good. There are new diagrams in the book, but overall, there isn't nearly as much change that occurred within the service design book as we saw in the service strategy book. Now, the service transition book, again, I kind of, what was needed, the whole concept of the configuration management system was a little bit vague when you looked from one book to another. And in fact, even though there were different diagrams, you could kind of understand what they were trying to talk about when they were showing you the different views of the configuration management system. But that has now been cleared up and is consistent across the books. There's also been a focus on cleaning up the language around, some of the technologies and the way that these processes interact. So what we see is a better description of the relationship between the CMS, the SKMS, with some examples. The whole concept of a change proposal has been cleared up and identified and better understood how it fits in. We see cloud coming into the overall transition planning. The process service evaluation has now been changed to change evaluation, which was really good, because when you have service evaluation in strategy and service evaluation in transition, it was a little confusing for learners. The service asset management is better defined now. We have a much better integrated approach to the processes, and we did see some improvement in the wording in the change management process, as well as a new diagram showing the flow. So about the same amount of change here in transition as we saw in service design. Again, there is the renaming of that one process to change evaluation, better explanation for how it fits into service transition. We got clarification on change models, better understanding, evaluation around the different change types. Just all in all, I think what we got out of this particular publication was not necessarily a tremendous amount of new information, but better explanation about what already existed in the books and the relationships between that book. Now, from service operation perspective, we had 5 processes, great, but the 5 processes didn't have the same process model applied to them. So what it meant was we got a lot of definition around incident and problem, but not so much definition around proactive problem management, access, event management, or necessarily the request fulfillment. So they kind of fixed all of that. There's a lot of consistency now. And then the missing part of proactive problem management is there. There's a lot more description around the types of techniques that you could use for proactive problem management. So what we got is a better understanding of the way service operations fits into the life cycle, better definition of the process and roles. We clear up the whole application development, application management discussion. And then again, as I said, we've improved these proactive problem management techniques. So here's a summary of the content that's in the service operation book. Now notice we kind of have an even balance here between what's new and what's been enhanced, because there were some significant things that I think we lacked within service operation. It wasn't like it was glaring, but it needed to be kind of put some more definition around. Again, we applied all the process model to all the processes. There is better description around filtering and correlation within event management. We have new process flows for request fulfillment, more techniques on root cause analysis, problem investigation and analysis techniques, the errors in the development cycle and how those relate to the service management life cycle. There's just a lot of additional value here within the service operation book. A lot of stuff that kind of filled in the gaps where we might have seen in the 2007 edition. Now, CSI, to me, the most glaring thing that we were missing was a way to manage improvement opportunities across the organization and across IT. So we see this addressed within the CSI register. There's now, some sort of a centralized focus for these improvement opportunities to be managed by this phase of the service lifecycle. Better organizational structure and content of the book. The 7-step improvement process has been improved. Service reporting and measurements are now methods, they're not processes. They even give us an example of a CSI register in one of the appendices, which I think was a really good addition to this. Then we have the CSI model is now called the CSI Approach. There was a little kind of different nomenclature in the book itself referring to that, and now we've got that cleared up, which I think is a really good thing. And the relationship between the CSI Approach, Deming cycle, and the 7-step improvement process has also been improved. So here we see, again, CSI does not have a significant amount of improvements here to the books, but at least the issues that we did have were addressed within this particular publication. Now, the last part about the books was the glossary that was in the back of each of the books. It seemed like you'd look up words that weren't in there. There were words that we didn't even seem to cover in the book, and I think there was a good effort in making certain that the glossary was much better aligned to the concepts that were actually in the book and the ones that students would look up. So the update was well needed. The ability to create greater consistency across the service life cycle and clear up a lot of the vague content, especially within service strategy, is a great value add. For those of you who have already taken, I would say, with the exclusion of service strategy, there's no real need to retake any type of classes. But if you took service strategy because you're in a position of really establishing strategy within your organization, you might want to consider maybe updating that certificate only because of the significant amount of change, and then it might help you in your job. But you could easily just pick up the book and read the differences, and maybe that would be enough to help bridge the gap. I don't recommend that you go out and buy the new books. I think if you have already purchased the library in the 2007 edition, you got a lot of the material. Maybe just looking at potentially buying a book that might be in the domain that you're focused in. Like if you're in service operations, it might make sense to get that book. Or better yet, we can kind of do the green thing and buy the PDFs or subscribe to the online editions of the books. So that's just the summary of what is now in the 2011 edition. I hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we'll pass it around to all your friends and let them know about the update to 2011 and what it means to them. Have a great afternoon, and I hope to see you again soon.